Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, it is I am the one and only Blaze the Cat here, and I am from the likes of the Mexi Toys videos. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our new Let's Play. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll present to you our Let's Play of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance, the third and the final game as part of the forms of the Game Boy Advance remakes of the Donkey Kong Country games. So, yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to dive into this particular version of the game for you guys out there, especially that we've almost about to catch up to the forms of the rest of the Donkey Kong games before we dive straight into the latest entry, Donkey Kong Bonanza, for Nintendo Switch 2, but that's not going to be until specifically for a long period of time, as was not only that Silver did somehow predicted that, but in addition to Sonic also predicted that as well, in between both Luigi's Mansion 3 and Mario Luigi Superstar Saga Let's Plays respectively. So, yeah, what's even crazy about this is though, is that specifically for the next couple of weeks later, that both me and Silver are both tackling through the different Game Boy Advance games. So yeah, that's actually pretty interesting, all things considered. Like, one involves around RPG elements, and then the other one is basically a remake based off from the good old classic Super Nintendo title, which appears to be, of course, Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Now, if you couldn't tell already, it's about the fact that, as you probably expect, that this particular version of the game is basically a remake of the original Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, although it no longer has the subtitle for it. So as you can see on the file selection screen, as well as the title screen, it looks incredibly different, doesn't it? Especially because not only for the fact that, as you can definitely tell, differently from the likes of the original Super Nintendo version on the file selection screen, rather than just taking place on the actual VCR, stands for Video Cassette Recorder, so instead we're able to actually dive into the underwater while you're selecting the files, while simply trying to control unguard the swordfish in order to be able to select your save file. Now, for those of you probably wondering, yes, just like the forms of how it does it for not only Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance, as well as Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance, as well as the forms of the majority of the Donkey Kong Land games between 1, 2, and 3. If you couldn't tell already from this footage alone, I'm going to be playing on the emulator, so just in case about the fact I should be able to actually classify for realize, not only because the screen resolution might be, pretty good for the most part, except the frame rate. So because of that though, I do apologize for that particular frame rate problems, but that's besides the point. So, now of course, just like last time, you can able to actually go into single player or two-player team. So as a result though, I'm pretty sure you do need the Game Boy Advance cable link as far as I'm aware, but since I'm going to be playing as by myself, this means about the fact that I'm only going to be selecting single player mode. So anyway, so since this is the 3-letter limit right there, I'll just simply go for BTC, stands for Blaze the Cat. So because of that though, yeah, with that being said, let's dive straight into Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance. Now, for those of you probably wondering, unlike the first two Donkey Kong Country games for the Game Boy Advance, as soon as you're able to dive straight into the actual game itself, the game usually starts off as the opening cinematic cutscene, right? Well, that's not the case in Donkey Kong Country 3, because we can just simply jump straight to the point, because as you can see, we're now onto the forms of Chromosphere, but except this time is that the entire layout is entirely different compared to the forms of how it does on the Super Nintendo original. So because of that, and there's also some background changes in between both the original Super Nintendo version as well as the Game Boy Advance version comparison. Like, for instance though, let's go and meet up with the forms of Wrinkly Kong right there. So as you can see, she no longer plays the N64 this time around, so instead, the entire layout is entirely different after all, because it may look like we ended up in a shrine for representing the forms of the banana birds, as far as I'm aware. So yeah, for those of you probably wondering what the story is going to be all about, if you ever played the Super Nintendo version of the game before, to put it simply though, is that both Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong are both missing, and it's up to Dixie Kong alongside with the forms of the cousin Kiddy Kong, which yeah, you pretty much get the idea for the fact that if you've already experienced the original Super Nintendo version of the game before, so yeah, you pretty much get the idea. So as you can tell, similar to the forms of how it does it for both Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance, in addition to Donkey Kong Country 2 also for the Game Boy Advance, you can now able to save your progress at any time, rather than just trying to meet up with the forms of Wankly Kong every time. So just in case about the fact that you can now able to save your game on the fly. So because of that, let's go ahead and pop over to Funky's Rentals here. So not only for the fact that we can meet up with Funky Kong again, except this time the entire layout is entirely different, of course. But in addition to that though, it's about the fact that you also decide able to bring in the cousins, such as Kiddy Kong right there. Despite the fact he might be a toddler, of course, so because of the looks and everything, so I digress. So yeah, a few things I want to talk about this though, before you're able to dive straight into the actual gameplay of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance version. Today's date, of course, there is the 1st of November today, in some cases in 2025 today. I can't even believe we're now on to the 11th month in 2025. And it's only a matter of time for the fact that we just literally got about 1 month left until we're about to be approaching ourselves into not only the 12th month, but also the final month in 2025, before we move along to a brand new year, 2026. So no matter what though, we just literally got about 2 months left now, exactly, until we're about to be approaching ourselves 2026 after all. So, anyway, so, yeah, as you can see, for the fact that every time if you do manage to hop onto one of the boats, you can now able to actually start to explore around small areas, as far as you can definitely tell. Like, for instance, though, we somehow found one of the, secret banana bird caves. So, to put it simply, though, we have to, watch the entire sequence, and you have to, press the actual corresponding button. And as you can tell, differently from the likes of the forms of how it does on the Super Nintendo original version, rather than just trying to use ourselves the full face buttons this time around, so instead we now need to use the control pads this time. So for instance, let's go for up and right, and as you can tell, that way we should be able to receive the first banana bird. So obviously though, for the fact that as be expected, this is going to be a 400% completion playthrough as be expected, so let's go straight into the first world in this particular version of the game, and that's of course Lake Orangatanga. So because of that, yeah, let's get into the forms of Lakeside Limbo to start things off with the entire adventure in Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance. Now, for those of you probably wondering, how come the music actually changes? Well, unlike the forms of how it does on the original version of the game on the Super Nintendo, David Wise does not compose the original version of the soundtrack on the Super Nintendo version, no. Because, relatively speaking though, is that David Wise actually did compose the soundtrack on the Game Boy Advance remake instead. So relatively speaking though, sometimes the music can be hit and miss sometimes, because some people attempt to prefer the original soundtrack for the sake of the forms of Donkey Kong Country 3 a lot more, at least specifically on the Super Nintendo version, just because of how, well, you probably get the idea about that. So anyway, and of course, sense about the fact that for those of you who have ever already played, not only the original Super Nintendo version before, but in addition to any other Donkey Kong Country games before, you'll fall right at home when it comes to the forms of the gameplay mechanics, and also, we somehow got ourselves the first DK coin right there. And to put it simply though, is about the fact that in order able to actually claim yourselves the DK Hero coin, is that obviously though, there's an enemy called Coin, and to put it simply though, we need to utilize with the steel barrel in order able to try to knock one of the coin enemies out. And then once you've done it successfully, then you should able to claim yourselves the hero coin after all. So obviously though, is about the fact that yes, I'm about to go after every single one of them, and as we expected, the bonus areas are returning, so nothing too special about it, aside from the fact that, well, obviously though, the reward system, if you do manage to complete the bonus areas, attempts to be a little bit different, although it might be a little bit slightly similar to Creme coins from the second game, except now, rather than just trying to get ourselves Creme coins, instead we got ourselves the B coins instead. And those coins will be useful until for later, which again, if you remember from our Super Nintendo version of the game before, you know exactly what's to come. So anyway, but there's one little thing you might able to realize, is that unlike the forms of how it does it on the original Super Nintendo version of Donkey Kong Country 3, that there's only like, I would say, 7 worlds to traverse into, or maybe 8. Well, technically speaking though, on the Game Boy Advance remake, if you couldn't tell, they also decided able to add an extra world that's only exclusive onto the Game Boy Advance version, which we'll talk more about that later on, because for now, we somehow fully completed the first level in Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance version. So let's move on now to the next level, which is Doorstop Dash. So, as far as I'm aware for this particular level's case, is that obviously though we have to keep on pulling the lever down to activate the doors opening. So because of that, so yeah, you pretty much get the idea for the fact that this game does manage able to actually bring us some level gimmicks to it. So because of that though, because that's something we have to get used to. So anywho, yeah, no matter what though, it's about the fact that since that we're now going to be trying to utilize with less buttons this time around though, this means about the fact that, you know, in order able to know how the controls work in this particular version of the game, is by simply pressing the A button will allow you to jump, obviously, and then pressing the B button will able to allow you to do a roll attack, or potentially speaking, I was just trying to run. And then if you try to press the R button, you can able to perform a tag action, similar to the forms of how it does on the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country 2. And not to mention though, for the fact that if you try to press the select button, obviously it allows you to switch between both either Dixie Kong or Kiddy Kong on the fly. And yeah, because generally speaking, I was about the fact that, well, when it comes to how the controls plays out to be, it plays pretty similar to the second game, but except the fact that obviously though, that if you couldn't tell, the color palettes are a little bit washed out, just like the forms of how it does on the previous Game Boy Advance Donkey Kong Country games for sure. I mean, relatively speaking, I was about the fact that, well, generally speaking, there's nothing else I can really say about the forms of how this particular version of the game plays out to be. I mean, sure, no matter what though, it's about the fact that there's going to be a lot involved this time around when it comes to not only several collectibles, but in addition to you know, the actual levels themselves, because, well, generally speaking, I was about the fact that, like I said before, that this version will indeed able to include the extra worlds that's only exclusive onto this version, instead of the original Super Nintendo version. So, yeah, you get the idea for that. So, but anyway, there's also another thing else I want to point out too, is that, potentially speaking of, what I've realized is that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is going to be getting a special vinyl release, and no matter what though, I'm pretty sure it's going to be releasing during at some point on June 19th in 2026 to mark the 40th anniversary of something The Legend of Zelda related, so that could be a possibility as far as this is worth considering about. So yeah, you get the idea for this point. So anyway, back into what I was saying about the forms of what the plot involves around in Donkey Kong Country 3, either on the original Super Nintendo version or the Game Boy Advance version. So, to put it simply though, both Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong has somehow got missing, and it's up to both Dixie Kong and Kiddy Kong are aiming to rescue Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong after they're gone missing. So because of that, I'm guessing it's most likely because of the forms of Chaos Tribe or something like that. So, yeah, it could be one of those reasons about the fact that we're only going to be playing as not only Dixie Kong, but in addition to Kiddy Kong as well. So because of that, yeah, you get the idea of what I was expecting. So, but anyways, so, and along the way though, for the fact that, yeah, just like last time, there are the usual collectibles such as bananas, and as well as the Kong letters, which if you grab all 4 of these letters to represent Kong, you're able to get yourselves an extra life. However, unlike the forms of how it does it in the Donkey Kong Country 1 for the Game Boy Advance, I'm obviously gonna able to actually try to ignore the Kong letters, to be more specifically, because they're just there for the sake of bragging rights, I suppose. But the ultimate main factor when it comes to getting 106% in the game, as far as I'm aware, basically though, we need to go after every single bonus areas and also try to complete the bonus areas, and of course, not to mention though, we need to able to obtain every single DK coins right there, as you can tell. And not only that though, we can able to actually complete every single levels, obviously. And not only that though, there's going to be a lot of side quests that we have to deal with this particular stuff, similar to the forms of how it does in the original Super Nintendo version, and you pretty much get the idea what the actual true 100%ing the game is going to be required with. So, and along the way though, just like the forms of how it does it on specifically Donkey Kong Country 1 for the Game Boy Advance, as well as Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance, there's going to be some additional mini-games here and there every once in a while. Like, for example, here's Cranky's Dojo, and to put it simply though, as you can see, this is where we need able to spend our bear coins, which are basically like the equivalent to banana coins from the second game. So, relatively speaking, I was about the fact that we had to start to be doing some bit of trading involved, and in order able to actually receive the banana bird, if you couldn't tell, we need able to complete the actual dojo training. So because of that though, and relatively speaking though, is that, yeah, let's go ahead and try to do some bit of training right here. So just in case we can able to block the actual specific enemy encounters right there. And in order able to try to get able to complete this particular training right there, you need to able to try to block all 30 of them to be exact, in order able to complete the actual dojo training. So because of that, although I won't admit it though right away, some of these mini games are pretty hit and miss sometimes though. I mean, relatively speaking though, there's a lot to do this time around, like I said before, compared to the forms of how it does on the original Super Nintendo version. Like, for instance though, I do generally believe, for the fact that, well, obviously though, for those of you probably wondering, for the fact that dang it, I somehow screwed it up. So yeah, if you somehow screwed it up, at least you can get some rewards back. Like, for instance though, you might able to actually receive, you know, bananas and all that stuff, but not the banana birds. So you have to specifically try to reach 30 of them to be exact when it comes to blocking those particular enemy ambush attacks. So, yeah, we'll go ahead and try it again. So, anywho though, and it's also worth noting for too is about the fact that we just literally got about, I would say, 6 or 5 more days to go actually, until Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment is going to be releasing for Nintendo Switch 2. And also, we've only got about approximately 19 more days to go until Kirby Air Riders is releasing. So because of that, there's a lot to be looking forward to, especially noticeable when it comes to November gaming releases during that time. Although, there is that specific game I want to classify for something, and that's of course for the fact that yes, we've also got about 13 more days to go until Dragon Ball Sparking Zero is going to be releasing for both Switch 1 as well as Nintendo Switch 2. Although despite the fact on Switch 2, unfortunately though, for physical version is going to be locked up behind the stupid game keycard release, which unfortunately though, the majority of the Resident Evil games coming out for Nintendo Switch 2, in between both Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, in addition to Resident Evil 8 Village, and even the upcoming Resident Evil 9 Requiem, I think is what it says anyway. Unfortunately though, the physical version on the Switch 2 versions of those games are once again game keycards, which as a result I'm like, oh for love of God, why? Why is this suddenly a thing? Especially because I understand for the sake of the forms of space capacity, but still, it just feels likely the missed opportunity, especially noticeable because what I can gather that the actual sales numbers when it comes to physical games for game key cards is not doing very well, especially because no matter what though, that most players out there, myself included, obviously attempt to prefer get the actual full game on the actual cartridge and you'll be good to go, rather than just try to utilize with the internet connection in order able to actually fully access to everything, which as a result, yeah, things gets a lot more convoluted as it seems. So anyway, so there's the next cave we somehow found, and logically though, there's our third banana bird. So how's that for that? So yeah, there's gonna be a lot of times though we can able to try to explore around in some scenarios, especially noticeable if there are certain caves that we do need to find. So anyways, let's move on to Title Trouble right there. So right from the start though, there's the coin enemy straight off the bat. So let's go ahead and try to utilize with our tossing technique, just like the forms of how it does on the second game. Although I will say, Kiddy Kong's voice, especially noticeable if you accidentally died as Kiddy Kong, my goodness, his crying voice is actually even worse in this particular version of the game compared to the original Super Nintendo version, I'm not gonna lie. Which you see what I mean if we do come across into trial and error annoyances here and there. And also, if you couldn't tell, yes, just like the original version on the Super Nintendo version of Donkey Kong Country 3, there's this particular technique called these water skimming, and it's actually pretty tricky to execute in this particular version of the game, just because the timing is a little bit different compared to the forms of how it does in the original Super Nintendo version. So you have to press the A button exactly at the right time if you decide able to do some bit of water skimming here and there. Also, I just realized there's a bonus area down there, which am I gonna take a risk by trying to get rid of Kitty Kong? Yeah, I might as well thought so. I might as well able to do a hardest thing to do by taking invincibility frames here, and that way we should able to reach ourselves the first bonus area in this particular stage. Although, mind you though, I noticed there's actually on guards the swordfish here and there, but relatively speaking though, we've already did somehow manage to get in there in the first place, so... Anyways, just like the Evolves of how it does it on Donkey Kong Country 2, there are certain bonus areas that you have to do a specific amount of objectives. Like, for instance, though, we need to collect every single stars, and also try to reach the coin itself. However, though, you can also try to able to bash certain enemies here and there. However, there's one little difference on the other hand, and that's what appears to be the introduction to grabbing the green bananas. So, if you do manage to grab several amounts of those green bananas, then you should able to actually try to able to complete that particular bonus area no matter what. So anyway, so this particular bonus area right there are two different methods you can do. You can either do Dixie Kong's ponytail thingy right there, or you can able to do a trickier technique by trying to utilize with Kitty Kong's water skimming. So ultimately though, I managed to do this in the easiest method by you know using Dixie Kong a lot. So but yeah, let me know in the comments down below for the question of the day. What was your thoughts about the forms of what's your first impressions in terms of the forms of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance? Now, for what I can gather, that some people seem to say that the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country 3 might be considered to be the best version of the game, at least in some aspects, but there is that one specific thing you might able to realize about something, is that unlike Donkey Kong Country 1 as well as Donkey Kong Country 2, both on the Game Boy Advance, there is that specific collectible is being absent in this particular version of the game of Donkey Kong Country 3. Is that, you know, with these camera items or these camera pickups that we somehow keep on collecting in between both of those games in the past? Well, the camera items are nowhere to be found in this particular remake. So, yeah, that's why I classified that. So I'm pretty sure the collectibles in this particular version of Donkey Kong Country 3 is going to be self-explanatory. So basically, though, that we can able to expect to try to go after not only the B coins, obviously, and in addition to the DK Hero coins, and also obtaining every single banana birds as much as we possibly could. So... but I digress. And also, straight off the bat though, is that this particular music in the background we're going to be hearing right about now, it almost reminds me like a Christmassy vibe, which I know for a fact that we just literally got about 1 month left until we're about to be approaching into Christmas. So, but either way, bit too early to say, but regardless of such though, let's go and bash those little Kremlin enemies right there to receive yet another B coin. So, how about that? So, yeah, no matter what, though, it's about the fact that for my, yeah, as far as you probably already expect, that yes, just like the Evolves of how it does on the other two Donkey Kong Country games for the Game Boy Advance, yes, indeed, I also got this as the physical cartridge version of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance, for the sake of the Evolves of the collection's sake. Although, mind you, though, just like Donkey Kong Land 3, even with the entirety of Donkey Kong Country 3 as the game itself, I don't usually fully complete this game either, but this is mainly because, like I said before, there's a lot to do in this version this time around, compared to the Evolves of how it does in the original Super Nintendo version, but either way, we'll get into more details about that if we somehow manage able to explore into the majority of any other worlds in this particular version of the game, so... And also, much like the Evolves of how it does it on both Donkey Kong Country 1 as well as Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance, there might be some levels has been swapped over in this particular order, which, if we get into the second world for instance though, we might able to expect to realize there might be some comparisons for the sake of the Evolves in the level order, so... But either way, that pretty much does it for this level right here, with the forms of Skitter's Row, so yeah, awesome and everything. Now let's get into Murky Mill. So I'm pretty sure we're about to be exploring into the murkiest darkness kind of basement kind of level like this, or the actual mill level theme right here, and this is where we come across into, well, Ellie the Elephant, which is basically kind of like Rampy the Rhinoceros, except, well, Ellie the Elephant cannot charge into enemies, unlike the Evolves of how it does it for Rampy, but that's besides the point, so... And also, in this particular level's case, if you do manage to stumble across into any other squeaky mice enemies here and there as Ellie the Elephant, Ellie the elephant will get scared. So because of that though, we need to pay attention to the forms of specific enemies just up ahead. So yeah, essentially speaking, that's as far as I can try to say about this, I suppose, when it comes to, like, well, for the most part, most of these levels are basically just very identical to the forms of how it does on the original version on the Super Nintendo, but except the fact that, obviously, though, the music composer sounds a lot different this time, because, you know, like I said before, David Wise is back for trying to compose the soundtrack in this particular version of the game specifically, because unlike the original Super Nintendo version, it's being composed by a different person, so I can't really tell what the different composer is exactly for the original Super Nintendo version is, because mind you though, it's been about, I want to say it's been 4 years ago since we've last played Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Super Nintendo version, since about the fact that Sonic did indeed manage able to tackle for that game back in 2021, that is, so anyways, let's go and try to use her trunk to lift up some barrels and try to toss it upwards to defeat those little enemies from above. So yeah, pretty self-explanatory right there. However, if you do manage able to fail these bonus areas, I'm not gonna lie, the actual failed montage can take a very long time to get through, because unlike the victory fanfare music, it just goes by a lot quicker, whilst on the forms of the failure fanfare, obviously though, it does take a very long time to able to get that music done and over with, which I'm not gonna lie, that's the only pace-breaking part. I have to admit though right away, if you're planning to try to go for 100% completion, that is, so but either way, so and of course, as we expected though, I believe if you managed able to press the B button, not only she can sprint, but in addition to trying to use her trunk to able to suck something up, like for instance, barrels, and also with any other you know, steel barrels for that too. But eventually at some point later on though, she can able to actually learn different techniques here and there until later on, so either way, so it looks like we somehow missed an O, but that's okay, because even then, getting the Kong letters is very optional, because unlike, you know, any other games, like, you know, Donkey Kong Country 1 for the Game Boy Advance, as well as the forms of Donkey Kong Land 1, if I can recall, if you really want to plan to save your game. And not only that though, jeez, I was not paying attention to that whatsoever. I mean, relatively speaking, I was about the fact that at the very least the screen resolution is actually, well, pretty good for the most part. Thankfully though, we're not trying to deal with the forms of that awful screen crunch resolution compared to not only Sonic the Hedgehog Genesis for the Game Boy Advance, but in addition to Mega Man and Bass for the Game Boy Advance as well, and maybe some other exceptions or any other stuff for that matter, like, you know, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe for the Game Boy Color, and even with the forms of any other Super Mario Advance games like Super Mario World and Super Mario Bros. 2 or something like that. I mean, relatively speaking, I was about the fact that I was originally trying to let not only Mighty, but in addition to Ray, originally they decided able to tackle through Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2, but they are not going to be ready for that just yet, because even then, because after all though, for the fact that we are essentially almost done as well when it comes to tackle through every Mario games to be released on not only for the Game Boy Advance as far as I'm aware, but in addition to maybe Game Boy games as well, and maybe Game Boy Color games as well, on the other hand. Well, I can't really judge on that front, but either way. So as you can see, we somehow managed to pull the flag at the end of the level, which means we somehow pull out the blue flag, which represents you somehow complete the level as Kiddy Kong, but then meanwhile for the pink flag, you're able to complete the level as Dixie Kong, so, and vice versa though really. And if you couldn't tell what's up with the forms of the golden flag right there, well, similar to the forms of how it does it for Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance as far as I'm aware. Oh, no way, it was actually the other version actually, on the original Super Nintendo version, is that, obviously though, the gold flag represents you somehow collected everything, ranging from the B coins, and in addition to trying to complete the bonus areas, and of course, obtain the DK coin, and yeah, you pretty much get the idea what this is going. So anyway, so as you can see, we've met again with the forms of Swanky Kong right there, since on the original version of the game too, except now that this entire minigame concept is actually also changed as well, because rather than just trying to hit the targets this time around, so instead, we're somehow experiencing a familiar half-pipe sequence from Sonic the Hedgehog 2 special stages. So, as you can tell, we need to collect as many of those stars as we could in order to able to not only try to get some rewards, but in addition to that, most importantly though, the banana bird as well. But I do know I've heard about something. There's actually a retro achievement system that you can able to try to complete this on a perfect succession, but I'm not gonna lie though, I'm probably not gonna participate on retro achievements. I mean, interesting for sure, but it's just that there are certain achievements are brutally impossible, especially noticeable if you really screw something up. Then obviously though you attempt able to try utilize save states with it. Well, you cannot allow to do that though, as far as I'm aware of anyway. I mean, I can't really judge on that front either, but either way, somehow we got about 90 stars out of 100, so this means we don't get the banana bird, but that's okay, because even then, I'm pretty sure in order able to actually access this particular Swanky's Dash minigame, is that you need to able to buy, or just, you know, persuade able to pay, 2 bear coins, so that's about it basically. So let's go and try this one again, and hopefully we would be able to try to reach up for about, I wouldn't guarantee to get a perfect ranking on this part though. I mean, relatively speaking though, I might try my best if I decided to. If only for the fact that the depth perception, as well as the quick respawn timing for the actual star locations are pretty picky sometimes. I mean, it kind of reminds me like a similar situation as the forms are trying to obtain those specific crystals in Klonoa 2, Lunity's Fail, if you go onto the forms the hovercraft or the hoverboard section. And basically though, it's about the fact in order to able to get every single crystals, you have to memorize the forms those specific locations inside out. And not only that though, just try to utilize with the double fairy item as wisely as far as I'm aware. So anyway, so at the very least though, we somehow collected for about 95 stars, so that should be enough to claim ourselves a glorious banana bird. So that's now the 4th banana bird we somehow obtained. So, but we still got a whole ways to go for this point, especially because this is the beginning portion of the game after all. So anyways, let's move on to the first boss in this particular version of the game, which appears to be Belch the Barrel. So to put it simply though, as you can see, basically though, in order able to actually try to knock him back, well, to put it simply though, we need to able to get this little beetle enemy out, and then when you grab the hold of it though, it's all about timing too, because otherwise though, if you time it at the wrong time, then chances are though, you might lose the battle. So because of that, and obviously though, I do really love the actual belching sounds every time whenever the Belcher the Barrel to somehow manage able to, well, belch out the barrel, and then if you manage able to let him eat that particular beetle bug right there, he will belch even louder and gets knocked back a lot further. So, yeah, relatively an easy fight if you pretty much know what to do for this point. So, I think we have to knock him for about 3 times. So, and I believe that should do it. And there goes Belcher the Barrel, as far as I can recall. I mean, mind you though, like I said, it's been, you know, 4 years ago since we've last played Donkey Kong Country 3 for our channel, according to what Sonic did tell me about this. So, and also, much like the evolves of how it does it for Donkey Kong Country 1 and Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance, every time you defeat a boss fight, Cranky Kong will show up to tell us about the fact that our next destination we're about to be heading to next is Crumbling Forest, which I'll save that until tomorrow, because while straight to the point, the actual uploading schedules for Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance is going to be taking place in weekends. So, yeah, that's why I classified that. So before we end off the video right there, I need to show you guys the warp barrels in this particular version of the game, because yes, straight to the point, similar to both not only Donkey Kong Country 1 on the Game Boy Advance, in addition to Donkey Kong Country 2 also for the Game Boy Advance as well, I will show you guys the warp barrels. So there's the first one right there. And just like before, it just takes you straight to the very end of the level, as you can definitely see. So because of that though, nothing new or anything else like that, except the fact that obviously though, we're no longer able to actually get into the actual transition between small rooms and all that stuff, and occasional bananas to collect. So it just literally takes you straight into the end of the level straight away. So anyways though, so I get the feeling that the next warp barrel in this particular level specifically, it is somewhere. Yeah, let's go ahead and use the attack action right there, and there it is right there. I mean, usually the warp barrels are not too far for able to try to find them, as far as you can definitely tell. I mean, relatively speaking, it was about the fact that they're pretty self-explanatory if you pretty much know what to do for this point. So, anyway, so that's that. And now it's going to move on to the last 3 levels in World 1. I mean, for the most part, Lake Orangatanga is pretty self-explanatory. It's like the first world in the game, so what to expect. But eventually the later worlds, though, it can get really tough later on. Especially noticeable towards the end game, basically. Just like the Forms of Power does on the previous 2 games for sure. So, and also, I will try my best able to try to go after a whole bunch of bear coins, because like I said before, there's going to be a lot of side quests that we have to deal with at this point in time. Like, for instance, though, there's going to be some important items that if you really want to go after, the majority of the banana birds and all that stuff, well, that's how the side quest system comes into play, just like the Forms of Power does in the original Super Nintendo version, so you pretty much get the idea what I was expecting, so... Anyways, if you try to let Kiddy Kong break for that particular plank right there, then you obviously only get the one of those items which I couldn't pay attention to. But anywho, also the user interface on the world map, it looks remarkably similar to the previous 2 Donkey Kong Country games for the Game Boy Advance. So yeah, that's one of pointing out right from the start. So anyway, if I could recall, the warp barrel on this level is going to be, well, if we go over here, then there it is right there. And I believe the last one for World 1, we have to utilize the attack action as far as I can usually recall that. So anyways, let's go in here to find the final warp barrel in World 1, and that way, that'll be pretty much does it for World 1 of its entirety. So anyways, let's do this, and there we go. And of course, we'll grab the 1-up balloon here and there, just in case we do need to rank up some more extra lives while we can, because eventually, like I said before, if we get into later progression in this particular version of the game, it can get pretty tough later on. So with that being said, that pretty much does it for World 1. So yeah, self-explanatory right there. And suffice to say for this point, guys, we should probably end things off this point right here. So join me next time for some more of Let's Play of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Advance. Is that we're going to be making our way to the second world, taking place in Cremwood Forest. So filled to the brim with a lot of interesting level gimmicks here and there. So yeah, I'll see you guys until tomorrow. Later, fellas.